Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much to the organizers of this conference. So I'll try to speak in English and I'll try to be on Swiss time. I'm not a specialist in narratology, so I want to say it at the beginning. Although narrative analysis, broadly understood, has a very long history, reaching back to Plato and Aristotle, and although it is fair to say that the origins of modern narratology go back to the first third of the 20th century, with Russian formalism and Vladimir Prof, among others, as a scholarly, self-conscious discipline, narratology emerged, I believe we can say, in the 60s of the 20th century. The empirical corpus of the emerging theory was verbal narrative, especially the novel, like in the case of Stanzel or Jeanette, and in thematic narratology, fairy tales and other narrative folklore genres. I think, in fact, its original domain was even more specific than verbal narrative. In its prime, at least, what is sometimes called formal narratology studied almost exclusively narrative fiction, although this was rarely consciously acknowledged. But at the same time, the ambition of narratology has always been, I think, to be a general study of narrativity as such, defined as being any process producing a story, une histoire. Consequently, its categories and analysis were also introduced into the study of drama or cinema, which means that they were exported beyond the domain of narrativity as it was defined by Plato, for example, and even beyond the domain of verbal representation as such to multimedia story worlds. This resulted in very valuable work, but perhaps also sometimes in some biases, especially in the case of movie story worlds. I think, for example, about the sometimes obsessive search for a narrator in movie narratives, which has been one of these biases. Anyway, since the heroic days of its official birth, narratology has undergone important changes, many of them having led to far-reaching new developments. I think the original verbal and fiction-centered biases have been overcome, and new fields of inquiry have been opened. New analytical categories have been introduced, vexing problems like the question of the narrator figure versus narrator-less narration have been, if not resolved, at least clarified. And last but not least, narratology has become more sensitive to historical evolutions and social groundings of narrative practices, forms, techniques, and effects. I think this Congress of the European Narrative Network is a splendid proof of the high achievements of a discipline which demonstrates that cumulative development of research in the field of literary studies is possible. But the question of narrativity has never been the property of narratology alone. Since several decades, it is also the object of intense scholarly interest in many disciplines outside the field of literary studies. For example, sociolinguistics, hermeneutical phenomenology, developmental psychology, artificial intelligence and computer science, social sciences, of course, and last but not least, I think, psychology and, more generally speaking, what is sometimes called cognitive sciences. At different moments and in different contexts, all of these exterior developments have had effects on the multiple branches of what, as I recently learned, is now called post-classical narratology, at least by insiders, but of course, you are all insiders. Narratology has seized these developments as challenges, which it has met and continues to meet with much success. Now, it seems to me that what these challenges have in common is that they invite narratology to proceed beyond the limits of literature proper and to contemplate narrative art in a broader view. In fact, there are several broader views which offer their specific insights. I limit myself here to only one of them: the problem of the embeddedness of narrative art in narrative competence seen as a human universal. As I just said, this is not the only broader view we should contemplate, but I think it is an important one, and I would like to outline it here in a very, very general way. For analytical convenience, I shall distinguish between 3 levels of exemplification of narrative competence. I call them narrativity, narrative, and storytelling. I use the term narrativity to refer to a specific form of organizing or processing mental representations. The term narrative will be used to refer to the outputs of narrative processing in everyday communication. The term storytelling will be used to refer to marked narrative, that is, any narrative for which, beyond the content of what is told, the performance of narrative processing itself is a point of attentional interest. According to this view, storytelling, contrary to plain narrative, would always have a meta-narrative dimension. That would mean that whatever the transmitted content, a story is also always interested in the act of telling itself. I think perhaps one could or should distinguish more than 3 levels. One could also certainly object to these definitions of the 3 levels, or draw the lines in a different way or at different places. But whatever the shortcomings of my proposal, and I am sure they are numerous, I believe that it catches relevant distinctions between different levels or intensities of narrative processing. And I think that these distinctions are important for the broader view of which I spoke. I will take a closer look at only 2 of these levels of narrative competence, the first one and the second one. That means narrativity and conversational embedded narrative. I'll bypass the 3rd level, the art of storytelling, and also the art of literature, storytelling, of course, which has been since the birth of narratology the central topic of the discipline. I'll bypass it for reasons of time, but also because it would be preposterous to try to enter into this very complex field without being a specialist. I'll begin so with narrativity. As I said, I use the term narrativity to refer to a specific form of organizing mental representations, and more precisely, temporally oriented representations of exterior facts as well as internal states. Many consider that narrativity in this sense constitutes a basic structuring principle of individual identity. Some readers of Ricoeur, but I think not Ricoeur himself, even think that personal identity is narrative identity. Others, and famously so, Galen Strawson, contend that the identity of the self is not a narrative one, or at least that the narrative self is only one option, the other one being what Strawson calls the episodic self. It seems to me that the debate is somewhat confusing, because the narrativists, as well as their opponents, generally share the same presupposition concerning the thesis of narrativity as a function of selfhood. It is seen as being linked intimately to the idea of a unique self extending through a person's whole lifetime. Galen Strawson, for example, advances his idea of episodic selves corresponding to different lifetime periods as a counter-argument against the idea of a narratively structured self. This is to say that he thinks that if you take narrativity to be a structuring principle of personal identity, this implies that you accept the idea of a unique self. But of course, even if there were no unique self, but only a multiplicity of episodic selves, like, for example, Marcel Proust thought, narrativity could nevertheless be an important structural ingredient of selfhood for each of these episodic selves. In fact, many psychologists working in the field of memory studies, and more specifically autobiographical memory studies, believe that the different versions of ourself are defined by specific long-term goals correlated to different lifetime periods. But it has also been shown that even if older versions of the self are displaced by newer ones and cease to function as the organizing core of the present self, they nevertheless remain accessible to memory. And they continue to have different functions, for example, in helping us to construct our personal lifetime as a story of changes. Anyway, whatever the answer to the somewhat speculative plane of selfhood defined philosophically, narrative processing of self-experience plays an important structural function in personhood. It has been shown that disorders in narrative capacities, so-called disnarrativities, are intimately linked to disorders of personal and social identity. This fact points to an interdependence between a well-functioning center of personal identity and the well-functioning capacity of narrativity as a way of binding and evaluating temporally oriented representations of the self. These findings are corroborated by memory studies, which show that autobiographical memory has a central role in personhood. Now, of course, memory in itself is not narratively organized, and memory retrieval as such, even retrieval of autobiographical factual knowledge, is not necessarily narratively structured. The retrieval of my birth date, for example, is an autobiographical fact, but it implies no narrative structuring. So one of the challenges is to understand how autobiographical knowledge relates to autobiographical narrativity. The first step for approaching an answer to this question is to remember that the core, or at the core of autobiographical memory, this experience is related to episodic memories. Now, think about Proust again. The psychologist Tulving, in his book Elements of Episodic Memory, dated from 1983, said that one of the characteristics of all recently encoded episodic memory is its tendency to represent time slices, roughly in the order of occurrence, and time slices which are characterized by changes in goal processing. So, episodic memory items seem to present a minimal narrative structuring. We have a sequence which is temporally oriented with a before and an after. And this sequence is structured around an event, a change in goal processing, which produces a new situation different from the initial one. And in a recent paper, Martin Conway, another psychologist, states that episodic memories are records of short-term goal processing, and more precisely, that they, quote, are formed at goal junctions of action sequences where there is a major change in the predominant goal. He goes on to say that in recent episodic memory, temporal information appears to play a prominent role, at least in the output of these memories. It seems to me that this reference to the central role of goal processing and goal changes can be read as a psychological rephrasing of Paul Ricoeur's thesis that the logic of action is at the heart of narrativity. But episodic memory alone is unable to yield an autobiographical storyline. This is due to the fact that episodic memories have a short lifespan, about 24 hours. After that, they are forgotten, unless they can be associated with what Conway terms the autobiographical knowledge base. This autobiographical knowledge base corresponds to what he calls, another place, the conceptual self. And the knowledge base appears to be structured in a hierarchical way. At the top, we have a life story, which contains, quote, general factual and evaluative knowledge about the individual. But the knowledge base may also contain self-images that divide and separate the self into several different selves. These divisions generally refer to the different life periods I talked about already. Life periods which are defined by clusters of long-term goals. For example, childhood, adolescence, entrance into professional life, forming a couple, deciding to have or not to have children, and so on. One important point is that the knowledge base has by itself no episodic structure, but a semantic one. although it generally consists of several clusters of personhood seen as following each other sequentially. Another important point is the fact that the self-image or the self-images, which are part of our conceptual self, are constrained by a principle of coherence among representations, and more specifically by a constraint of internal coherence of the self-image. Due to this constraint, as a rule, only recent episodic memories which are consonant with this self-image become associated with the autobiographical knowledge base and though can be accessed in the long term. Dissonant recent episodic memories are generally filtered out. This, of course, is not always the case, as we know, but it is, so to say, the default option of the ego. A third important point is that autobiographical memory can be seen or should be seen as the output of an activation of the knowledge base combined with associated episodic memories. This would mean that the narrative structuring of selfhood should be seen as a result of a binding process between the conceptual self as defined in the knowledge base and episodic memories. The knowledge base would yield the overall structures, and it controls the process of association of episodic memories. The episodic memories ground the structures on a temporally oriented level, and also, which is very important, assure that the narrativity takes on an experiential aspect, processed as a recollection on the level of conscious self. This interaction between knowledge base and associated episodic memories corresponds neatly, perhaps too neatly, to the interaction between paradigmatic and syntactic structuring principles in the construction and processing of conversational narratives and also of artistic storytelling. Let me add a last important point concerning narrative structuring at the level of autobiographical narrativity, mental narrativity. The inceptive or more pervasive recollected storylines activated by autobiographical memory and which assure an experience of continuity of personhood are characterized by a very high degree of plasticity. This is due to the constraint of the principle of coherence, which presides over self-images. There is a permanent negotiation between these constraints and the association of new episodic memories. Changes in the self-image produce changes in the associated episodic memories. Some episodic memories are repressed, others are transformed. False memories pop up and take the place of the repressed ones, and so on. So in some way, autobiographical narrativity is like oral performance, as it has been studied by Perry and Lord. It lacks the fixedness of a written text. I will finish this short reflection by some words about the second level of narrative competence, which is narrative defined as a component of everyday communicative interaction. The pragmatic aims of this everyday narrative or embedded incarnation of narrative know-how are very numerous. They can be informational or persuasive and manipulating, sincere or insincere, serious or playful. Its epistemic status is also very diverse, factual, fictional, true, false, and so on. And its forms are innumerable, extending from diffuse narrative fragments to full-blown narratives. The difficulty of analyzing communicational narrative is due specifically to its embeddedness. Most of its exemplifications cannot be studied by a purely internal analysis, but only by taking into account the larger communicative frame in which they occur. This difficulty explains perhaps why the initial genre of communicatively embedded narrative, which has been extensively studied, has been the interview type provoked storytelling. Think about Labov and Walensky, for example, all these narratives have been provoked narratives in an interview situation. The second practice, which has been extensively studied, is what is called generally conversational narrative. For example, Monika Fludanik or Neil Norrick have done studies in this, important studies in this field. Now, one could think that this type of study, the grounding of narrative in an ongoing conversation or dialogue should be the focus. But in fact, strangely, an important characteristic of the majority of the studies of conversational narrative is the fact that they identify narrative with what I would call storytelling, that is to say, with marked narrative. The implicit idea seems to be that narrative is storytelling, or to express myself clearer, that whenever we engage in narrative practices in everyday life, our constant aim is to end up with a full-blown story, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. In conversational narrative storytelling, in everyday talk, Norrick, for example, distinguishes several types of conversational storytelling: spontaneous and solicited storytelling, storytelling as an answer to a general request, please tell a story, storytelling induced by storytelling, you tell a story, okay, I tell another one, collaborative storytelling, and so on. As you can see, he is interested especially in marked narratives, stories which are framed inside of the ongoing conversation. He shows some interest in what he calls diffuse stories or inchoate narratives, but he thinks that in such cases the listener must always piece together a coherent story out of the piecemeal fragments. Monika Fludanik, in her land-breaking work towards a natural narratology, dated 1996, links what she calls narrativity, and which corresponds grossly to what I term narrative here, with experientiality, and not with temporality or sequentiality. Experientiality, is of course a very important factor of fictional narrative, and also, which is very interesting, also I have no time here to follow up this point, it is a very important factor of autobiographical memory due to the presence of episodic memories. Third reference to Proust, if you want. But in Fludanik, this definition of narrative by experientiality results in the fact that in some way she has to exclude or at least to marginalize what she calls, for example, narrative report. That is plain, simple, chronological narrative without presentifying effects. And quote Fludanik, the aim of the report is to provide information, not to tell a story. The most striking structural facet of report lies in its lack of the schema of incidents, which constitutes the core of experiential episodic narrative, whether of personal or vicarious experience. Thus, reports frequently consist of a series of actions or events and a final result, and there is a noticeable preponderance of then clauses, whereas in experiential stories, so would be by far the most pervasive discourse maker. Also, since reports do not have to perform aesthetic gymnastics, balancing tellability with narrative point, evaluative and commentatory asides are rare, and the whole intonational differentiation of narrative levels is rendered functionally irrelevant. Now, if Fludanik draws the line at the point of narrative report, this is due to her definition of narrativity by experientiality. Notice that her definition also marginalizes historical narrative, as she explicitly states. So, though Monika Fludanik starts from what she calls natural narrative, and more precisely conversational narrative, her outlook is in fact centered on a theological, fiction-centered vision of narrative. Fludanik even speaks explicitly of a phylogenetic perspective. Now, I think this way of proceeding is quite illuminating if one wants to study the path leading from conversationally framed narrative to literary fictional narratives. But it excludes the description, or marginalizes at least, the description of communicatively embedded narrative, and even of some types of marked narrative in its factual forms, be it report, historical narrative, but also testimony, news breaking, some forms of journalism, and so on. I think it also biases the understanding of the function of narrative in communication. This function is not always to emerge as a full-blown story, nor can the absence of a self-enclosed story always be counted as a communicational failure. Narrative organization of sequential matters of fact often occur in conversational exchange as a natural way to convey information about temporally organized processes or parts of processes. But I think this is a way of putting into practice narrative competence. It seems to me that in fact the study of narrative in everyday communication can go three ways. One can see it as a starting point for narrative art, which is what Fludanik does. One can also see it as an exemplification of narrative competence in its own right, and I think this is what we also should do. And finally, one could see it as an output of mental narrativity, a move which also seems to me a legitimate one, although I believe a very complicated one. This being said, one must add that the dividing line between everyday narrative and the art of telling stories is a very fluid one, notably in oral cultures and more generally in oral contexts, where markers of storytelling are sometimes difficult to assess. But this is a practical problem more than a theoretical one, and it seems to me that we should follow Ruth Finnegan and draw the line at this point between marked and unmarked. In a written verbal narrative, the markers are, of course, generally more prominent. Fictionality is a very strong marker of storytelling. Due to its specific pragmatic status, to its peculiar formal symptoms, and to its paratextual landmarks, which are often present, fiction, at least written fiction, is strongly set up against the constitutive rules of real communication. But functional markers can be as effective as, let's say, in the case of police reports or judicial testimony. Unfortunately, we still do not have a systematic account of the different markers and classes of markers which detach storytelling from communicatively embedded narrative. Many questions remain open, among which the following one: is written narrative as such a marked narrative, or are there unmarked cases of written narrative? But I think this is a point where philosophical analysis must pass the problem on to the social sciences, which I gladly do. One last word, perhaps. One of the most vexing problems of the broader view I introduced in a very general way here is the question of how these different forms of narrative processing relate to each other, and more specifically, the question to know if this is all about a bottom-up process leading from mental competence to the art as a cultural fact, or if there are also top-down circulations from the highest level to the lowest. One interesting fact concerning autobiographical memory is the following one. Infantile amnesia, the well-known fact that we do not remember events from early childhood, does not imply that no episodic memories are formed in early childhood. This is understandable. Without episodic memories, children, as well as most animals, could not even construct short-term goals, what they do. But what seems to be lacking in this at this early age is the autobiographical knowledge base. That is the structure which constructs the access to episodic memories in the long term. Now, the construction of this knowledge base is the result not of a psychological process of maturation, but of social interaction. This would explain, for example, why US children have more early childhood memories than children outside of the USA. Conway, for example, thinks that the difference appears to be due to the fact that American mothers, quote, undertake more memory talk with their children than mothers from other countries. This hypothesis of a cultural structuring of the autobiographical knowledge base is also consonant with another fact. It is the cultural diversity of the paradigmatic structure and evaluative system of the knowledge base. Several studies have shown that in China, for example, childhood memories are more socially oriented, less ego-centered, and less emotional than in cultures with, quote, independent self-focus, like our own culture. Now, on the other hand, communicative interaction also feeds stories and into the child's mind, and that means that it feeds ready-to-use structures for narrative constructs of self-images. If all this was true, at least partly, it would imply that narrative competence is at the same time biologically and culturally grounded. Narrativity would be impossible without the capacity to form episodic memories, which is a biological fact of humans and many animals or other animals. But narrativity would also be impossible without the existence of a knowledge base which is a socially constructed fact and which takes huge advantage on the linguistic capacities of humans. If this speculative hypothesis was valid, this would imply that narrative competence is the result of a biological and cultural co-evolution. And so it would be meaningless to oppose natural narrative and the cultural art of storytelling. Thank you very much.